Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Joe Lonsdale. Joe Lonsdale is the managing partner at HVC, a US-based venture capital firm which manages several $1 billion in committed capital. He was an early institutional investor in many notable companies, including Wish, Oculus, Joby Aviation, and Guardant Health. He has been on the Forbes 100 Midas List since 2016 and was the youngest member included in 2016 and 2017. Before focusing on institutional investing, Joe co-founded Palantir, a global software company known for its work in defense and other industries, as well as for providing the platform to run the COVID-19 Common Operating Picture for key decision makers in over 35 countries. After Palantir, he founded and remains chairman of both Addepar, which has over $2.5 trillion managed on its wealth management technology platform, and OpenGov, which provides software for over 2,000 municipalities and state agencies. More recently, he's also a co-founder of Affinity, Apirus, Esper, SwiftScale Bio, Resilience Bio, and other mission-driven technology companies, which he continues to create with his team out of the 8VC Build program. Joe, welcome to my podcast. You and Taylor, your wife, and my husband Neil, we've been friends for some time now, and you know, my audience doesn't need to know. I've come to know a young, brave, intelligent couple, you and Taylor, who are really, really excited about serving your community, but you want to serve your community in the sense of understanding what is wrong with our institutions, and then finding something that the two of you can change. Before we get into all of that, I just wanted you to tell my audience a little bit about your early childhood. When I come to dinner at your home, and one night, I think it was Shabbat, we observed Jewish ritual. But then I also know that your mom or your dad, one of them was Catholic.
Well, thanks, Ayaan, for having me. It's an honor to be on. You know, I was raised in a Jewish household. My mother was Jewish and my father was raised Catholic. He wasn't as religious as my mother, and my mother was sort of in charge of this part of the dynamic.
But what is it? So this is in California, Fremont, California.
That's right. My parents were from Massachusetts, but they met in California. And I was raised in Fremont, the oldest of three brothers. And we had we weren't particularly religious. We had a traditional Jewish upbringing in the sense that those were traditions we followed. And I think, both my mother and father would talk about Jewish and Christian values, Judeo-Christian values. So those have always been important in shaping how we see the world. Part of the values that I always liked was this idea of tikkun olam, which is that for 6 days of the week, you're supposed to be working and repairing the world and doing your best to help fix things that are broken. And on the seventh day, you're supposed to rest.
Fantastic. And in this, I think the Christian or the Catholic side of the story, they also have that sense of working for 6 days or 5 days and resting for the seventh day. Maybe the Catholics don't observe it as religiously as the Protestants.
I'm very bad at observing it too. I have Orthodox friends who turn off their phones, and I like to imagine they pray and spend time only with their families. And I'm unfortunately not as disciplined as I should be, but I admire the tradition very much.
Yeah. But if I want to translate your childhood of a mixed marriage like that, would you agree that at least in Fremont, California, it was a complete melting point, not only between Jews and Catholics, but between everyone else?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, Fremont, California, there were a lot of immigrants. It was the heart of Silicon Valley. It was a lot like Star Trek on TV at the time, which was kind of like, you felt like a little bit of a post-racial in the sense that there wasn't a lot of identity politics. I had a lot of friends who were, East Asian and Indian and MC Hammer actually moved next door to me, so I had all these black kids around as well at the time.
Very noisy.
Yeah. So it was middle class, but he moved next door before he got really wealthy, but he was just starting to get famous. And like we got in, some fights with some of those kids from the get up, and then you become best friends because little boys fight and become friends. And so it really was, it was pretty much a melting pot, and it was not really focused on identity politics. I kind of felt more Asian almost than anything else because there were more Asian kids in my classes, but so very, very, very big mix of cultures.
And when you're growing up, do you remember who was the governor of California at that point?
I'd always heard stories about how before, when I was younger, there was Ronald Reagan and stuff, because he was the president at the time when I was growing up in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was older, Gray Davis is a high schooler, but to be honest, in the 80s, I don't remember the governors very much. I think I've met a couple of them, but they weren't really on our mind at the time.
Interesting. Those were the days. Paradise.
Yeah, it wasn't a big focus. Things worked well enough that if you had to be involved in politics, there was a sense that maybe there was something wrong with you, because why were you focusing on that when there's so many other things that are wonderful to focus on?
So many wonderful things to be doing. Yeah. And when Silicon Valley is emerging, how old were you and how did you get involved, and what was it like?
Oh, well, I guess you could say I was really lucky, because I was living in the heart of Silicon Valley in a lot of ways. A lot of my friends' parents and friends' older brothers were building companies in the 90s. I was in high school from 1996 to 2000. And they were just so much, there's just a sense that anything's possible, and a very solutions oriented culture where your job was to reimagine the future and try to build it. And of course, there was a lot of nonsense because people reimagine the future incorrectly. But there was also just so much fun stuff going on. We all learned to program at a young age. It was so I was kind of right in the middle of it and just seeing a lot of things be attempted.
And do you remember when Google Facebook was quite late, but I remember if I look at the defining companies of our day today, I remember stories. My first tech story was when in the Netherlands in 1999, everyone thought the world was going to go to hell because of this millennial scare.
Yeah.
You were in the middle of it. What was that like?
That was there's a lot of debate about how big a deal that would be or not, and whether or not people could fix things. I tend to be an optimist. I figured people have been talking enough about it, they probably could fix it, which I think a lot of them did. Google was really the late 90s, and it really started to become a real thing in Silicon Valley that mattered. And I remember hearing about it and being really excited, and I thought these guys must be so cool because they're naming their company after a big number, which, as a math nerd in high school, that was a very fun thing. And there was a lot of talent going there. When I later built my companies about 5 years later, Google was a big inspiration because it really was a place where it's like a playground for smart engineers, where the engineers are really empowered to be in charge of a lot of what's going on. And I thought that was a really cool type of culture to model yourself after at the time.
So you use the word cool a lot. It's like, I'm probably something like 20 years older than you are. And I think, oh my gosh, tech, the nerds, Microsoft might have been, Microsoft. What was the other one? The one
Oracle, maybe, and Microsoft were big ones back then.
Never heard of Oracle. Oracle was late for me. That guy.
Apple, maybe Jobs and Apple in the 80s.
Before Steve Jobs, before he came up with Apple. What was that? There's a Macintosh and Apple for Macintosh. Yeah, it was Microsoft Macintosh. So you see, I'm a dinosaur. I date back from that time when.
I feel very old about this these days, because nowadays all the young kids actually do think tech is cool. It's actually it's like if you talk about tech at like a bar, you're not just laughed out of there. Where when I was in high school, it was not socially like a hip thing. It wasn't a thing you're supposed to kind of do it quietly and in the background and not mention it in public. When I went on spring break for the first time at Stanford, I was in the kind of more engineering oriented fraternity, but our national fraternity, guys were teaching us how to talk to people at a bar, because this is something we were not naturally skilled at. And they say, Joe, you should pretend you're an American studies major, because they'll much rather want to talk to you as an American studies major, not a computer scientist. And that I'm told has changed a lot in the last 20 years. I think it's okay to be a computer scientist at a bar now, but that was not the case 20 years ago.
That is true. Yeah, that is true. So there is now a culture where at least a conversation in the English language is possible between engineers. And I don't know, is the word nerd still a derogatory term?
I think it's like partially positive in a lot of circles now. Yeah, it's a culture shifted a lot on that. People like just to say that they're nerds, even if they're not sometimes.
It's completely shifted, yeah.
That shifted somewhat.
Yeah, we all want to be nerds now. Unfortunately, we are not. So it's really possible today to talk, to have a conversation between nerds and non-nerds. And I remember when nerds were derogatory, and they were seen as sort of little robots, but now they rule the world.
They really do in a lot of areas. It's pretty amazing seeing this just drastic shift the last 20 years where, I mean, just the best way for every industry to work has been rethought by technologists. And so they really have shifted everything.
Yeah. Tech has had and has given us a lot of positive stuff, huge impact, positive impact on human life. But there have been some negative things. For instance, on institutions. And I wanted to ask you, what would you say would be the negative impact that tech has had on media?
Yeah, well, there's this incentive that's changed thanks to social media that really echoes, I guess you'd say, the yellow journalism of 120 years ago, right? With the whole Spanish-American War kind of sensationalist sort of thing with Hearst back then, where the incentive is you have this clickbait to get people to see it, and so it's actually evolved to a point where in order to get people to click through, you have to basically be affirming what they want to hear, and really polarizing people to the extremes of what they want to hear. So you've actually pulled people's views using this media apart to the extremes, and you can kind of see this evolve over the last 15 years when you measure views and you measure polarization on a lot of kind of commonly argued topics and perspectives. And so unfortunately, tech's really not only kind of broken our media to the point where it's kind of hollowed out these big organizations. There's no longer these like powerful monopolies that kind of had a institutional duty. Instead, they're kind of hollowed out, focused on the polarized parts, so you don't trust the institutions anymore. And it also really has ruined the dialogue in politics in our country in a lot of ways. I don't think you can blame all of this on tech, but the tech incentives are definitely behind a lot of these problems we're seeing with these institutions.
And one of the things that I've been noticing is that it's now become a business model. So once upon a time, the institution of media, that is to bring news to people, information, and then analyze and meditate on all of that information and knowledge, that was really separate from entertainment. Mm-hmm. That all of these boundaries have been blurred now, and everything is going down to entertainment. It's really just about making money, and we are being told by outsiders in, well, that's capitalism for you. Screw you. You wanted free markets. You have it. That's what
it is really fascinating. I think the area where capitalism and tech do the worst by far is in media, which maybe justifies why people in media tend to be so anti-capitalist, because the incentives for capitalism within media seem to lead to this very polarized, very dystopian result if you don't have institutions that exist for reasons beyond just capitalism.
And then it affects our politics in the sense that then that type of profit-making incentive, it just gives so much power to the people on the extremes in politics, because that's what sells. Middle of the road, sensible, bipartisan, purple politics, that doesn't sell, that doesn't sensationalize. So would you say that that's true?
Yeah, that's definitely where the forces are pushing. And you definitely, in order to fix this, you definitely need some responsible, successful people and others to collaborate to create counter forces. If you just let the natural forces win here, it's actually quite a negative result.
And how can we win? Because how do you then get people within Silicon Valley, within politics, within Wall Street, within the media corporations to come together and say, there is a part that is really about social cohesion and keeping our society and our nation together, and probably even the world, because America is the leader of the world. This
seems like a sort of nonprofit duty that people have to take up, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with successful people from both sides getting involved with trying to build media, with trying to even potentially, as Bezos did with the Washington Post, hopefully purchase organizations and try to direct them to be moderate and to be open, to be trusted sources of news that are maybe not pursuing their full business incentive, which is to be so polarized. And so this is one of those things where the leaders in our culture have to step up and be leaders. I'm trying to create some of this media myself with this American Optimist thing we're working on. I think I'm just learning how media works. It's not my skill set, but right. I think we all have to be thinking about how can we contribute to be part of the good part of this, because there is this force that's very dangerous right now.
And please, let's talk a little bit about that danger. You and Taylor, you've moved out of California. I know precisely where you lived. I don't want to say where it was, but you left. You went to Austin, Texas, and you didn't only go for business reasons. You also went because of the blight, because of the decay that's happening in San Francisco, the Bay Area. And, for those of us who are left behind, we say, the only thing we can do is appeal to our politics, like fix it, but they can't. It's a one-party system.
It's interesting. In some ways, there's three parties in California. It's 1/3 on the right, it's 1/3 on the moderate left, and it's 1/3 on the progressive left. And the progressive left is a little bigger third than the moderate left, unfortunately. And so it's a supermajority left run by the progressives. And it's just an interesting thing. I know you talk a lot about extremists in the issues in the Islamic community, but it's a really interesting analogy to me where there's all these people on the left who are unwilling to stand up to the extremists and say anything against them. And so the extremists end up running the left in a lot of these cities and a lot of these states. And it's a real problem. I think it's probably a problem on the right and other parts of the world too, where people just aren't willing to stand up to the extremists on their side, and they end up breaking a lot of things, and it's a real problem.
It is a real problem because it's basically a one-party state. If all the power went only to the right side of things, they would do exactly the same. Things would decay. That's why those wonderful, founding fathers, they came up with the balance of power. You need two parties. You need a loyal opposition. And in the states where there is no loyal opposition, you see decay.
Well, they get captured by special interests, right? Which you've definitely seen. In Texas, I think things are a lot better, but it's not quite as one-sided. But you do have the right's been dominant for a long time. And there's certain healthcare interests, certain education interests that capture parts of the right and stop competition, stop the best ideas from winning in those areas too. So every area where one side's in charge, you have to watch out what special interests are running things. In California, there's a massive amount of horrible special interests that have captured them, and it's a real problem.
And what is the answer? So you left, Elon Musk left, Larry Ellison with Oracle left. A lot of people are leaving. And to us, of course, that's horrifying. It's awful for California, to be left in the hands of these crazy, radical, left-wing progressives. Is flight the answer? I can't imagine that to be the answer.
Well, there's famously there's voice and there's exit, and there's different battles of fight. America is too important to me to exit. And so America is something I want to fight for. And I believe we can fight for, and we can rebuild our institutions and make it a great country. California is going to be very hard to fix, in my mind, in the next 10 or 20 years. It's going to have to hit rock bottom before people realize there's certain structural issues. And it's pretty clear right now. They're going to keep going after and demonizing the successful people. They're going to keep stopping us from building new places, new homes we want to build. And they're going to keep the cost of living so high. There's basically only like a very rich class and then a service class. And they've really been wiping out the middle class based on other policies. And I think it's going to be hard to fix that until things get a lot worse and people wake up and throw them out. And that's not going to happen in the near term.
Well, I hope you're right. Another institution that I think that has been whacked around, it's the family. And part of it is with Silicon Valley, where children live behind screens and they're constantly tuning into you have young children, I have young children, and we have constant dire warnings, the number of kids that commit suicide because of technology, the number of kids that are in depression because of technology. Can you speak to that? How much technology do you allow your children to consume?
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the family and go right to the technology angle. I thought you were going to talk about the 20 to 70% of kids born out of wedlock in certain communities or whatnot. But I think the technology is an issue as well. We have 3 young daughters. The oldest one's 4 years old now. And we just try to have really strict limits on screen time. I don't know if the screens and the technology themselves lead to too much depression and isolation as long as you limit them. I do think there's probably this big danger for young women with social media that's a much bigger danger than with young men. I think the dynamics between young women on these things get a lot nastier on average. I mean, both can have problems, but I think you have to especially watch out for that from the data I have seen. And we are debating at what age do we let them get on social media? How do we moderate it? How do we make sure it's not something that's too tough on them? I think it is naturally really hard on the young women, how they interact together and how they can be ashamed and made fun of on these things, which is, I think that's what leads to some of the more really drastic outcomes.
And you're absolutely right. Also, we need to talk about, and this has now become a taboo because it's been politicized. I'm not embarrassed about saying it. I think it's common sense. A human child's interest is best preserved within wedlock by 2 people who are married. Because they love one another and they respect one another, not because they're forced into a marriage, not broken marriages, single parenthood, all of that. I mean, these are options that come around and a child has to survive within that context, but it's not the ideal. And to say what I've just said is in some circles taboo.
It's very strange to me that it's taboo because people always talk about believe the science, and it's like the data is just absolutely clear that a lot of the biggest problems in our society is kids who are not raised with 2 loving parents. And obviously there are exceptions where there's no loving parent that does a great job, and we should laud them for doing a great job and having successful kids. But as much as possible, you want to have two loving parents, and that's we've actually created by mistake, I think, some really bad incentives in our society that's led to the out of wedlock rate of birth just going dramatically up in the last 50 or 60 years. And, I think you get a lot of people talking about, the legacy of slavery, for example, in this country and all the problems it causes. And I'm sure there are still some problems from legacy of slavery, but this is not a legacy of slavery. I mean, in the Black community, it was only 20% even. And in the white community, obviously separately, it was in the single digits. If you go back 60 years, now the white community is over 30%. The Black community is over 70% out of wedlock births. And it's obviously a huge crisis because by statistically, you're just far more likely to go to prison or to have problems with education or to be depressed. And I'm not quite sure why we're not working on it. It actually really scared me. I saw the BLM people said that they're against the nuclear family. It's almost like a comic book villain or something. Why would you be against it unless you're purposely trying to hurt our society? It's just very strange to me.
Yeah, and I don't put it past them. I think they actually are trying to hurt society. And here's then where these linkages come between other institutions not standing up to these people and say, no, we don't want to destroy the nuclear family, because that actually is the key, it's the foundational institution.
We don't have people standing up for these things anymore as much as we should. I think that's right. I think people have been just browbeaten into just being quiet, and it's very unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. It's harmful. And I think one of the things that I like to talk to you, especially, and other people who've built stuff and who've made these huge changes, is that after all the talking is done, after we've analyzed all the problems, you're just also solution minded. You say, okay, what are we going to do next, right?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't come to you about what are we going to do about the family. I know that your family is incredibly beautiful and happy and healthy, and you lead by example in that sense. Mm-hmm. When it comes to education, which is the next level institution, we're also seeing these people. I don't want to say take control. I don't think that they have taken control. But they have made attempts at taking control that are pretty dramatic. They've introduced critical race theory, critical justice theory, and other terrible ideologies into the classroom, first in universities and then in high schools, and now even in elementary school. And I know that you and Taylor are involved in trying to sound the alarm on this, and not just sound the alarm, but also try out some innovative things. And again, that brings us back to the question of, do we reform the existing institutions? Do we build new ones? Is it a combination? What do you think, Joe?
Well, it's definitely a combination. I think anything in society, I think a lot about things in terms of like system level thinking and how things evolve. And And, markets, I work in lots of industries, and markets will naturally evolve where you have ideas that compete against each other. And in industries, the good ideas will naturally win over time because they're more profitable and they're a more efficient way of doing things, and people learn and people copy the better ways of doing things. And that's why we all become richer over time. That's why our economy, grows faster than the number of people. And so there's other areas of our society where there's not really these same forces. And if you look at education, there's just, it's one of the most dangerous things you can have in these areas is for it to be top down, where something can just control it from the top. And then because if they break it, there's no way to fight that. So what you want it to be a distributed system where there's some ways for good ideas to win. There's some ways for bad ideas to lose. And so for me, the most important thing we could do for education, like by far, is just to let the parents of poor children be able to choose for their kids. I think if you had the competition of poor kids being able to choose, this would be dramatically different results. And it's kind of obvious. Like we already, like all rich kids, all people who are well enough off, like your family and my family is well enough off that we can choose for our kids where they're going to go.
Right.
And the fact that we have that and poor kids don't, like that to me is one of the worst forms of inequality that exists in our country. And so we have to give the ability for poor kids to choose and say, I don't want to go to this school for my kid. I don't think it's as good as this one over here. I'm going to go to this one over here. And so enabling choice for parents to me is just such an obvious thing. And that would fix so many things. And you know what? Some of them would choose to go to some critical race theory stuff that I think is horrible. And I'm going to argue with them. And I'm going to explain to them why it's neo-Marxist. And I'm going to explain to them why it's not helping our society. But at the end of the day, I think it should be that parent's choice if they want to go to that school. And it should be another parent's choice if they want to go to one that maybe gives both sides, or maybe just something else. And the fact that we're imposing on these people and not giving them choice and we're deciding top down, to me, that's just the worst way of doing it.
So you would say then the future of philanthropy, because I guess the future of our country depends on it, the future of philanthropy, the future of lobbying politics, political leaders, is to say, let us give parents choice when it comes to educating their children. Mm-hmm. Number one. And then number two, there should be options.
And there should be. And I say especially poor parents, because they're the ones that don't have it. If you were just to pass a school choice bill to give everyone choice and give everyone the money they take with them from the system, there's reasons why that wouldn't work right now, because there's already so many wealthy kids who are already in private schools that if they got the choice money, it would instantly drain a ton of money out of the core system. And so I think there's a legitimate argument on the moderate left. We can't just do a blanket school choice bill, because that actually just like gives money to the rich who are already just going to use the money for the thing they're doing anyway. But I think at the very least, we should be able to compromise and say, okay, let's start from where we are now. For parents making under 75,000 or under 100,000, whatever it is, let's start by giving them choice. And I think even just that, and of course, in order to give them choice, you're right, you have to be able to make it so people are able to start things. And so as long you have to let us start things they can choose without making it too hard to get approved. And you should give them the choice. And that combination, I think, would actually solve everything. Like our societies are work really well bottom up. We don't have to do everything for them. We just have to give them the ability to let ideas compete.
Yeah, but then in that case, we'll be up against forces like the unions, teachers' unions.
The teachers' unions are very against choice. They don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to have to compete. And this is every industry in America. There's all sorts of industries that would rather make it impossible. Like hospitals are very good at passing laws to stop a new health clinic from opening up nearby, because then they have to compete and then they can't charge 5 times as much. So like every industry in America that's broken right now, whether it's healthcare, whether it's prisons, whether it's parts of education, they're gonna use the government to try to stop competition. And one of our kind of underlying mandates as good citizens is we should be trying to allow competition in all these places and allow choice in all these places.
And empirically, it's been proven, at least with education, as far as I can see. Thomas Sowell, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, has harped on this quite a lot. His latest book is on that. If you look at the outcomes for children who same income, same poverty, same challenges, same, literally in some neighborhoods, even same households, kids the kids who do go to these charter schools, they do very, very well, way better than the public schools that get way, way more money.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That's cool that he's shown that. I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell. I haven't seen that study yet, but that's intuitively correct. Of course, if you could choose to go different ones, I mean, you just having any form of choice and accountability just makes these things better.
And then let's look at the bigger implications. If we go down the path of decay, sort of one party takes all thing, the institutions that are just left to their devices, not checking the negative aspects of technology, that doesn't only, we don't only implode from within, but it makes it very easy for our adversaries to come in. What would you say if you were talking to our political leaders, you'd say, how would this, if you're within the Chinese Communist Party and you're looking at America now, and you're looking for weak spots, what is it that you would really take advantage of?
Well, I mean, if I was within the Chinese Communist Party now, I'd be funding things like Black Lives Matter, which I would guess that they are, which is a neo-Marxist philosophy at its core that's trying to use something that we feel guilty about that has some truth to it to rip us apart. I'd be funding different things to rip us apart. I'd be going on social media and finding ways to get people to fight over identity issues, over silly political issues. I'd be sharing memes that make people angry at the other side. And there's very good evidence they are doing things like this. I mean, this is the right way for an adversary to tip you apart. I think one of the biggest things is that hurts us is that, America for a long time had this attitude of optimism of, Peter Thiel calls it indefinite optimism. It's not exactly clear what the future's going to look like, but it's very clear it's going to be better. And there's lots of these great possibilities, and it's impossible to tell exactly, but there's just lots of ways to solve problems. And we've gone from kind of indefinite optimism to definite pessimism. And it's just this crazy thing where like there's this like self-fulfilling prophecy where if you run everything with this pessimistic framework, you actually do bring about a much worse world. And I think identity politics, where we're seeing everything that's like defined through our race, defined through our gender, defined through our income. This is all part of this definite pessimism kind of framework where it's just like really cynical and like all these things define us in ways we can't escape. And it's like it's kind of like a Calvinist worldview as opposed to a Judeo-Christian worldview, if that makes sense, right? The Judeo-Christian worldview is that everyone can be redeemed, and it's our duty to fix the world, and we're kind of working in this positive way. And this like kind of older Calvinist worldview is that everything is kind of predetermined, and it's like, and you're either going to go to heaven or not, and then just you're either going to, it's just there's already, we know what's going to happen, and there's no way escaping it. And if you're poor, you're poor, and if you're rich, and it's a very weird pessimistic thing, but it really is like a different, it's like we like to think everything is new, but it really is like a shift from this positive, optimistic Judeo-Christian modern worldview back to this like nastier Calvinist worldview. And I'm not sure where it's coming from or why people are embracing it, but it's really scary to me.
It's scary, but I think as long as we have people like you in the places that you are at, we can fight it, because that ultimately was the idea of America, is that we're going to go break out, go rogue, try something new, and then, we go to America. So I will continue to be optimistic, and we'll continue this conversation. And Joe, thank you so much for what you do, and for even being interested.
Thank you, Ayaan. Well, I'm excited to build new institutions and to keep talking to you about them. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving my podcast a rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time.